Break.
Hey there, and welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. It's been a few weeks since I've dropped an episode of the Cutting Room Floor. I've been putting out a series of videos that are kind of in-house denominational stuff, and so I've been busy with that. Haven't been able to do a Cutting Room Floor in a few weeks, but I'm back, and I wanted to do to answer a question that I think many of us have asked at one point or another, and that's the question of what happens when we die. Last Sunday, we looked at a sermon from Luke's gospel, and we looked at one of Jesus' appearances to his disciples that comes right after his resurrection, and he appears with his disciples. And what's striking is that Jesus has this resurrected and glorified body. And so in spite of everything that he's endured on the cross and beaten and suffering and horrific death and so on, he's actually alive and he's with his disciples. And one of the things I emphasized in that message there, which there'll be a link at the end of this video to that message, one of the things I emphasized there is that the resurrection of Jesus actually points us to what we can look forward to. And so when Jesus returns, the Christian point of view says that we don't just look forward to a heaven that's a bunch of spirits floating around in the sky somewhere, but actually what we have to look forward to and what we have to anticipate is actual physical bodies. And that's a contrast to the idea of what was known as Gnosticism, where really the most important thing that matters is your spirit and your soul, and your body is actually a prison or it's a tomb, and this world is all evil and corrupt and it's so terrible, and one day we get to be freed from it. In contrast to that, Christianity actually says, no, God created your body as good, and he created the world as good, and in the end it will ultimately be redeemed and perfected. And so we looked at a little bit of that. But that got me to kind of thinking along this question of, okay, but what about in the meantime? What about from that moment that you breathe your very last breath on this earth until the time that Jesus returns? What happens in that time? And what more specific do we have to look forward to? There are there are few places that we can go in the Bible that I think give us a pretty good answer to this. There's some of this that's really unknown, right? The Bible doesn't ever, so far as I can tell, it doesn't ever talk about, going towards a great white light or floating up above your body or something like that. You've maybe heard stories of that sort. The Bible doesn't, I don't think, give us a lot of detail about that, but here's a couple things. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to put a couple verses up on the screen so that we can look at these together. Here's the first one. This is from Luke's gospel, and this is actually when Jesus is on the cross, and it's a pretty well-known account because Jesus actually there's two criminals. There's one on the left and one on the right, and Jesus is with whoops, here we go. Jesus is one of the here we go. Jesus is with these two criminals, and one of the criminals actually speaks up, and here we go. Found it. One of the criminals actually speaks up and speaks to Jesus and says, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says something rather important. And that's here in Luke chapter 23, verse 42. Jesus says, "I tell you the truth today, you will be with me in paradise." The important word here is this word today. Jesus makes it clear that paradise is not something that we'll have to wait until some future experience. Jesus is emphasizing the fact that this criminal, as he's breathing his very last breaths, he can anticipate that his suffering will end, and very soon he will enter into the paradise of the presence of God. Now, strictly speaking, what are we talking about? Are we talking about heaven? I want to be really, really technical here and say, well, it depends on what you mean, because there's two ways of understanding what heaven is all about. Is heaven the renewed heavens and the new earth, that's often what we think about. That's kind of what we think about into eternity. We think about what will stretch on without any end. And I want to suggest that we use the term heaven we reserve the term heaven to talk about the new heavens and the new earth, the renewal of all of creation, the perfecting, the purification that will come after the return of Christ. In the meantime, however, we do not enter into some kind of soul sleep, as it's sometimes been called. We don't simply, cease to exist for a period. We enter into the presence of Jesus between now and the time that Jesus returns. And again, one of the ways that we know that is based on what Jesus says to the thief on the cross. He says, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. He doesn't say, I tell you the truth, when I return, you will enter the joy of my kingdom, or something like that. He doesn't say that. He emphasizes that paradise and perfection begin the moment that we die and that our life on this world ends. However, there are other verses that tell us more. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul is speaking to a church in Corinth, likely that had been heavily influenced by some of those Gnostic ideas, some of those ideas that somehow our bodies are corrupt and vile and flawed, and therefore we should not expect to have any kind of physical existence in the new heavens and the new earth. Paul is addressing that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul goes into great detail about the hope of the resurrection of the body. And here's what he says. I'm going to highlight this verse here. What is sown perishable is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It's sown in dishonor. It's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness. It's raised in power. A natural body raised in a spiritual body. Now, what Paul is getting at here, he's setting up a contrast between the bodies that we have now and the bodies that we will one day receive. So Paul is telling us that at the end of time, as we know it, when Jesus returns, then we can look forward to the resurrection of the body. Our physical bodies that in this life are subject to decay and disease and sickness and death and so on, those bodies will be resurrected again. It doesn't matter if you've been dead 5 minutes, 5,000 years, not to be too crass about it, but bodies decay, and sometimes even the manner of death contributes to that real severe decay. But what Paul is saying is that even though our bodies are buried perishable, when he talks about sown, he's talking about being buried, they will be raised imperishable. They will be perfected. They will not be subject to the same conditions that we experience in this life. The weaknesses and the limitations that we presently live with, we will not have to contend with in the new resurrection bodies. Now, what does that exactly look like? Well, I think the Bible leaves a lot of that unanswered for us. I do know, for example, one of the places that I'll often go is in Isaiah chapter 40, where it talks about running and not growing weary and walking and not growing faint, mounting up on wings like eagles. That suggests that some of the limitations that we have, just physical limitations, will be lifted. I think it's safe to say, because Paul writes about this in Philippians, I believe it's Philippians chapter 4, where he talks about our bodies being made like his glorious body, which is a way of saying that if we want to understand what our bodies will be like in this world, the best thing we could do is look to the kind of body that Jesus experienced post-resurrection. And we see some things about that. We see that obviously he is able to move from place to place without being detected. And yet at the same time, we see that he is recognized by his disciples, although for a time they were not able to recognize him. So, what exactly do you do with that? It suggests kind of this continuity and discontinuity, this connection with our present bodies and this disconnect. There'll be things that are noticeably different. And we can look forward to that. And then, and of course, we know that Paul is talking about this as a future event, because in the next verse down here in chapter 15, Paul is talking about this as being at the last trumpet, and when the trumpet sounds, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. So there's this transformation that takes place at the end of time. Which brings me to the last verse that I want to show you, and that's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. This is one of the most well-known verses, I think, on what happens at the end of time. We sometimes call this the rapture. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. The Thessalonian Christians were worried about what had happened to their loved ones who had already died. They were worried that they were going to miss out on the events of the end time. And so Paul writes to reassure them and to comfort them. And he makes a couple of notes for us. He says, first of all, that God will raise to life, God will bring with them those who've fallen asleep. He's talking here about those who have already died, and Paul assures them that they will be resurrected again, that all who have died up until the time that Jesus returns will be brought back from the dead. And then he talks about the Lord himself descending from heaven. And this is a way of course, referring to Jesus coming down from the clouds from heaven, just as he left. We read that in Acts chapter 1, where we're told that just as Jesus was raised, so he will also return to us, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And I don't want to get too far into this because there's a lot more we could say about this, but this is where then we get the idea of the rapture. Now, some people understand the rapture to mean this instantaneous event where Christians are suddenly taken up and disappear. And so if you're on an airplane flying and both the pilots are Christians, somehow you better hope there's someone else on board who's not a Christian who can fly the plane, because the pilots have both disappeared. Or you're sitting there, driving cars, and all of a sudden, drivers disappear and cars are off careening through intersections, and it's kind of this chaotic picture. It makes for great cinema and great movies and such, but it's not very biblical, because when the Bible talks about the rapture, it's talking about this idea here of meeting the Lord in the air. And the word there is actually, it's a very particular word that comes out of Greek culture, where a city that would be hosting a visiting delegation, usually a very important, a VIP kind of delegation, that city would send out a welcoming committee to greet that VIP delegation. They would meet them a little ways outside of the city and then escort them back into the city. And there the city would host a reception for the visiting delegation. Sometimes that visiting delegation would preside over matters of justice. And so if the visiting delegation had, high up government officials, then they would sort of hold court and people could bring their complaints and justice would be done. So you get a picture there of what the rapture is. It's really not this sudden disappearing of Christians who vanish into thin air. What it is it's Jesus bringing his people to meet him in the air and then returning down to the earth. And that's where then the final judgment takes place, in the establishment of God's eternal kingdom from that point on. And that's why then Paul says, and so we will always be with the Lord. So he's talking about that time after Jesus returns, the final judgment is carried out, and then the creation has been purified and perfected and freed from all sin, and therefore then we live. That's what we talk about properly when we understand what is heaven. Heaven is the new heavens and the new earth, the renewed cosmos. And I do believe that we will be able to explore it. We will be able to enjoy all of creation, and it will have connection with what we experience now. In other words, if you don't, I've always wanted to see the Swiss Alps. I might not make it there in this lifetime, but I do believe that I will have the opportunity to do that in the new heavens and the new earth. Or, maybe you want to go hiking in the Sierra Nevadas, or you want to go exploring the Amazon rainforest or something. You will have that opportunity in the new heavens and the new earth. But you will enjoy these things without the stain of sin affecting it in any way. So what happens when we die? Well, when we die, immediately our spirits are brought into the presence of Jesus. Our spirit and our soul, our spirit and our bodies are separated. Our body is buried, as Paul uses the language, it's sown in perishable form. And our spirit is brought into the joy of Jesus. We will be united with Jesus at that point. But yet it's not the full picture yet. It's not the full experience of heaven just yet. We enter into the joy of paradise. We enter into the joy of seeing Jesus and being in his presence. And yet we await the time when God's redemptive plan, you might say, reaches its full completion. And that is at the return of Jesus, where justice will be fully executed, the worlds will be cleansed and perfected and freed from all of its sin and stain. And from that moment on, we enjoy the new heavens and the new earth for the rest of time. So there you have it. That's what I believe that gives us a biblical framework, what we have to look forward to, something to get excited about, something that sustains us in a world where we see so much pain and sadness and sorrow and suffering. We have this hope to look forward to. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll do it again sometime soon. And don't forget, if you like this video, there's other videos that you can click on and watch them. And of course, check out our church website at sunnyslope.org, and be sure to come by and visit us if you're in the Salem area. All right, thanks, and take care.